She was mopping the floor when the billion-dollar empire started bleeding. Nobody noticed her. Nobody ever did. That was the thing about being invisible. You got to see everything. Her name was Camille Osei, and every morning at 6:47 a.m., she pushed her gray cart through the glass doors of Vantara Capital's 42nd floor headquarters, past the framed Forbes covers, past the signed memorabilia from 3 different presidents, past the receptionist who had never once looked up from her phone to say good morning. Camille would nod anyway. She always did. Her mother had taught her that dignity didn't wait for an invitation. Vantara Capital was the kind of company that made other companies feel small. Founded 11 years ago by a man named Darian Wolf, it had grown from a 3-person fintech startup in a rented basement in Austin, Texas, into one of the most aggressive algorithmic trading firms on the planet. Darian had been on the cover of Wired. He had keynote Davos. He had given a TED Talk that had been viewed 47 million times, the one where he stood in a black turtleneck and told the world that the future of finance was not human. It was elegant, precise, and machine-made. The audience had given him a standing ovation. Darian had smiled the smile of a man who believed he had already won. And maybe he had. Vantara's flagship algorithm, the one they called Axiom, had returned an average of 31% annually for 6 consecutive years. Hedge funds paid obscene licensing fees to run it. Sovereign wealth funds had quietly funneled billions into portfolios it managed. 3 separate regulatory bodies had reviewed it and found nothing worth questioning. Axiom was, by every measure that mattered in Darian Wolf's world, perfect. Which is why nobody was prepared for what the screens started showing that Tuesday morning in March. Camille was working her way down the East Corridor, the long stretch of glass-walled offices that looked out over the main trading floor, when she first saw the red. Not a little red. Not the ordinary, tolerable red of a market correction or a minor position loss. This was the kind of red that made men in expensive suits go very, very quiet. She slowed her mop without thinking, because something in the atmosphere had changed, the way air changes before a storm, thicker, heavier, charged with something unspoken. Inside the main boardroom, 6 people sat around a table that cost more than Camille made in 4 years. She knew this because she cleaned that table every morning, running her cloth in slow circles over its surface, and she had once overheard Darian tell a visitor it was custom Italian marble, hand-cut, $46,000. She had gone home that evening and looked at the water stain on her kitchen ceiling and thought about that number for a long time. Darian was standing at the head of the table, his sleeves rolled up, his jaw tight. Beside him stood Marcus Vell, Vantara's chief technology officer, a soft-spoken man with the kind of eyes that were always calculating something behind whatever expression he was wearing. Across from them sat Priya Anand, the firm's head of quantitative strategy, and 3 senior analysts whose names Camille had learned because she paid attention to things like that. And then there was Jerome. Jerome Achebe was 28 years old and had been at Vantara for 14 months. He was the youngest person in the room by nearly a decade, and he sat at the far end of the table with his laptop open and his back very straight, the way people sit when they are trying not to look as frightened as they feel. Camille had spoken to Jerome exactly twice, once when he'd held the elevator for her and said good morning like he meant it, and once when he'd found her in the break room at 7:15 a.m. and asked if she knew where the extra coffee filters were kept. She had shown him. He had thanked her twice. She liked Jerome. She did not like what she was watching happen to him now. "Walk me through it again," Darian said, and his voice had that particular quality, soft but pressurized, like a lid screwed too tight. "From the beginning. Slowly. Because what you're describing doesn't make any sense to me, and I need it to make sense to me." Marcus cleared his throat. The losses began compounding at approximately 4:23 a.m. Eastern. By the time the overnight monitoring flagged an anomaly, we had already. How much? The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Camille counted them. "Current confirmed loss is sitting at approximately $240 million, Marcus said. "But that number is moving." Nobody breathed. "Moving," Darian repeated. "Every 60 seconds, roughly, we're seeing another. Every 60 seconds. Darian turned away from the table and walked toward the window. He stood there with his back to the room, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he turned back around and looked directly at Jerome. "You flagged something last week. A discrepancy in the execution logs." I want to hear about that. Right now. Jerome opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I submitted a report to the system's review queue. It was, I noticed some irregular timestamps in Axiom's trade execution layer. Entries that appeared to be doubled. I wasn't certain of the cause, so I documented it and escalated through the standard. The standard channel. Darian's voice hadn't risen. It had done something worse. It had gone flat. So you noticed something that might have been a problem, and you put it in a queue. I followed protocol. Did you flag it as urgent? A beat. I flagged it as high priority. High priority. Darian looked at Marcus. What's above high priority in our system, Marcus? Critical, Marcus said quietly. Critical, Darian repeated. He looked back at Jerome. Walk me through your logic. Walk me through the exact thinking that led you to decide that what you were seeing was high priority and not critical. Jerome's jaw tightened. His hands, flat on the table, were very still. I didn't have enough data to confirm it was a systemic issue. I had an anomaly. Flagging something as critical triggers a full system review, which would have halted live trading. Without confirmation. Without confirmation, Darian said, we're down $240 million and counting. He said it conversationally, almost pleasantly. That was the thing about Darian Wolf that made even experienced executives uneasy. He was most dangerous when he was calm. You're an analyst. That's what analysts do, isn't it? They analyze. They make judgment calls. You made a judgment call, Jerome. It cost this company. The room was so quiet that Camille, standing 10 feet away in the corridor with her mop and her gray cart, could hear the hum of the air conditioning in the ceiling. Jerome said nothing, and that was when Darian noticed her. He turned his head and saw her through the glass wall, this woman in the gray uniform, standing still with a mop handle in her hands, her eyes on the screens behind him where the red numbers continued their slow, methodical climb. Something crossed his face. Irritation, mostly. Maybe a flicker of something else that he didn't let stay. He walked to the boardroom door and opened it. This is a closed meeting, he said. Not to her specifically. In the general direction of her presence. Camille looked at him. I'm sorry, she said. I'll come back. She reached for her cart. Where are you from? Darian asked. She paused. I'm sorry. Your accent. Where are you from? It was the kind of question that is never really a question. Camille recognized it the way you recognize weather, not because someone tells you it's coming, but because you've been outside enough times to feel it in your bones. Ghana, she said. Darian nodded, as if something he had already decided had simply been confirmed. Well, he said, when you come back to clean, try not to leave streaks on the glass this time. It looked terrible yesterday. He went back inside and closed the door. Through the glass, Camille watched him return to his position at the head of the table. She watched him say something to Marcus that made Marcus write something down. She watched Jerome stare at the surface of the table as though he were trying to read something written there in a language he didn't know anymore. She pushed her cart down the corridor. She mopped the floor of the empty conference room at the end of the hall. She restocked the supply closet. She did all the things she was supposed to do. And the whole time, a part of her mind was running very fast and very quietly, the way it always did when it had caught on to something. Because Camille had seen something in that boardroom. Not intentionally. She hadn't been trying to see it. She had simply been in the room, the way she was always simply in rooms, and she had looked at the screens the way she always looked at things, with the full attention that most people reserved for things they thought were important. She had spent 3 years watching finance videos every night after her son, Kofi, went to sleep. Not because she had plans to become a trader. She had no such illusions. But because she was methodical by nature, and methodical people fill the hours between midnight and sleep with the things that interest them, and what interested Camille was systems. The logic behind them, the patterns in them, the places where they broke. She had seen the numbers on the screen. She had seen the timestamps. She had seen the interval. Every 60 seconds. She mopped in long, even strokes. She thought about what she'd seen. She thought about Jerome's report. She thought about duplicated execution logs. She thought about a loop that fires on a timer and what happens when that loop calls a function it shouldn't call twice. She thought about her son, who was 12 years old and wanted to study computer science, and about the school she had picked for him, and the fees that came due every September, and what those fees required of her every single day in this building. She thought about what it would cost her to do what she was now considering doing. She put her mop back in the cart. She walked back to the boardroom. She knocked. Darian looked up. His expression was a perfect economy of contempt. "I asked you to come back later," he said. "I know," Camille said. "I'm sorry to interrupt." She had learned a long time ago that apology, deployed correctly, was not submission. It was a door. "Your system is duplicating trades." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. The first silence had been the silence of fear. This one was something stranger, the silence of people who have just heard something from a direction they weren't looking. Marcus was the first to speak. "I'm sorry." "The execution layer," Camille said. She kept her voice even. She was speaking to Marcus, not to Darian, because Marcus had the kind of eyes that actually listened. "I saw the timestamps on your screen when I was in the corridor. The losses are occurring at a 60-second interval. Exactly 60 seconds. That's not market movement. That's a loop." Nobody laughed. She had expected someone to laugh. Nobody did. Jerome had gone completely still. His eyes were on her face with an intensity that felt like recognition. "A software loop," Marcus said slowly. "Something in your execution layer is triggering twice per cycle," Camille said. "If the loop runs every 60 seconds and each iteration fires the trade command once, but your system has a condition that's calling the function a second time before the cycle closes, you'd see exactly what you're seeing. Not random losses. Systematic ones. Same interval, escalating volume." Priya Anand was leaning forward now. "What kind of condition?" "I don't know your code," Camille said. "I'm not a developer. But I know what a pattern looks like. And this pattern has a source." She paused. "I think your analyst already found it." Every eye in the room moved to Jerome. Jerome looked at Camille for a moment. Something in his face changed, a tightening, an unwinding, both at once. He turned to his laptop. His fingers moved across the keys. He pulled up a file. He read. He read again. "The update," he said quietly. "The system update that went live 8 days ago." He was typing faster now, his voice picking up momentum. "I flagged duplicate timestamps in the execution log, but I was looking at them as a data integrity issue, not," he stopped. Typed. "There's a callback function in the order execution module. It was modified in the update to include an asynchronous confirmation request. But the original synchronous call wasn't removed." He looked up. His face had the expression of someone who has just seen something terrible and something clarifying at exactly the same moment. Every time Axiom executes a trade, it fires the order twice. Once synchronous, once async. They're going to the same endpoint. The room moved. Not physically. But something shifted in it, a collective reorientation, the way a school of fish turns in water, all at once, without any one fish leading. Priya was already on her phone. Marcus was already at the laptop station along the wall. Two of the analysts were talking quietly and quickly to each other. Darian Wolfe stood at the head of the table. He was looking at Camille. She looked back at him. Not with triumph. Not with anger. With the same steady attention she brought to every room she entered, because attention was what she had instead of everything else. "Who are you?" he said. It was the first time he had asked her that. "Camille," she said. "I cleaned this floor Monday through Saturday. I've worked here for 2 years and 4 months. He said nothing. "Your glass looked fine yesterday," she added. And then she went back to her cart. What happened over the next 4 hours was, by any measure, extraordinary. Jerome guided the engineering team through a complete audit of the execution module. The patch took 90 minutes to write and 40 minutes to test against a simulated trading environment. At 1:14 p.m., with 3 regulators on a call that nobody in the building had expected to be on that day, the correction was deployed. The 60-second losses stopped. The number on the screen, which had climbed to a confirmed total of $312 million by midday, went still. Not gone, but still. In the markets, stillness was sometimes the best you could ask for. The chief investor, a man named Roland Fitch who ran a sovereign wealth fund with more assets under management than the GDP of several small countries, had joined the call from Geneva at 11:30 a.m. His voice, delivered through conference speakers, had the particular timbre of a man who was choosing his words the way you choose steps across ice. "What I need to understand," Roland had said, "is whether this was an isolated failure or a symptom. Because what the market will hear, regardless of what actually happened, is that Vantara's flagship product executed $300 million in erroneous trades over a period of approximately 9 hours without its internal systems detecting the anomaly. What the market will hear is that detection came from outside the technical team. I need to know how you intend to speak to that." There was a long pause. "With transparency," Darian said. It was the first thing he had said in nearly 20 minutes that wasn't a logistical instruction. Roland had gone quiet in the way that suggested he was reserving judgment. The call had ended without resolution, which in that world meant the resolution was coming. It was simply choosing its own timing. The building emptied slowly that evening. By 8 o'clock, only a few lights were still on. Camille finished her shift and changed out of her uniform in the small staff room near the service elevator, the one without windows, and she sat for a moment on the bench with her bag in her lap and her eyes closed, listening to the particular silence of a building after hours, the ventilation, the distant hum of servers, the faint sound of her own breathing. She was tired. She was always tired. That wasn't new. What was new was the knock on the staff room door. She opened it and found Darian Wolfe standing in the corridor in his shirt and his rolled-up sleeves, looking like a man who had not slept and was beginning to realize that sleep was a more complicated thing to find than he had previously believed. He didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. "I was wrong," he said. "About the glass. About your name. About—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been wrong about a number of things today, and I find that I would rather acknowledge that directly than not." Camille looked at him. "Thank you," he said. "What you did today." "I did what anyone would do if they saw a problem," Camille said. "No," Darian said, and for a moment his voice had a different quality, quieter, less managed. "No, that's not true. Most people in your position would have kept walking." "Most people in my position," she said, "can't afford to keep walking." He absorbed that. "I want to offer you," he began. "I would like a formal acknowledgement," Camille said. "In writing. That the identification of the error came from my observation. Not for credit. For my son. I want him to be able to read it someday. I want him to know that his mother saw something that 300 analysts missed and she said so out loud." Darian was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said. "You'll have it." 3 weeks later, the story had migrated beyond Vantara's glass walls in the way that stories do when they are more interesting than the official version. Quietly at first, through internal channels, then louder, carried by a junior reporter at a financial technology publication who had a source inside the building and a good instinct for what readers would remember. The headline, when it came, was careful. It spoke of a critical software defect in a leading algorithmic trading firm's execution layer, discovered during a routine morning by a member of the facility's staff. It used the word serendipitous, which Camille read and quietly disagreed with, because serendipity implied accident, and what she had done was not accidental. It was the result of 3 years of night videos and a mind that had never been able to look at a pattern without wanting to understand it. Jerome was promoted. Not quietly. Formally, publicly, with an announcement that came with a new title and a mandate to build a human review layer into Axiom's update deployment process, a layer that would require a second set of eyes on any code touching execution logic before it went live. He called it the gap protocol because he said the most expensive mistakes in any system weren't the ones you could see. They were the ones that lived in the gaps between what you assumed and what was actually true. He called Camille before the announcement went out. "I want you to know," he said, "that I've told everyone who mattered exactly what happened. Exactly who said what and when." "I know," she said. "Thank you." "How's Kofi?" he asked, because he had learned her son's name the way careful people learn the things that matter to the people around them. "He built his first program last week," she said. "A temperature converter. Celsius to Fahrenheit." "Tell him to keep going," Jerome said. "I will," she said. "I do." Darian Wolf gave one interview in the weeks following the incident. He gave it to the same financial technology publication that had broken the story, and he sat across from the reporter in a conference room, not the marble table one, a smaller one, and he answered questions that most executives in his position would have deflected or routed through legal counsel. He spoke about the culture of speed that had led to the update being deployed without adequate stress testing. He spoke about the way certain assumptions, about who had valuable things to contribute, about where expertise was allowed to live, could create blind spots in an organization. He did not use Camille's name, because she had asked him not to. But he described what happened with an accuracy that left no doubt. "The most expensive thing in any system," he said, "is the certainty that you already know what you need to know." The reporter asked him what had changed. Darian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm listening differently." That's a small answer to a large question, but I think it's the honest one. The article ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been shared widely enough that it crossed into general business media, then into the kind of cultural conversation that attaches to stories about power and its inversions. Camille didn't read much of the coverage. She had a floor to clean and a son to get to school and a course in computational finance she had enrolled in, online, self-paced, the kind that cost $80 a month and was taught by a professor at a university whose campus she would probably never set foot on. She was 3 modules in. She thought she was beginning to understand something about the relationship between systems and the people who build them, the way a system always reflected the assumptions of its architects, carried their blind spots encoded into its logic, reproduced their certainties at scale. She thought about this in the mornings while she mopped, and in the evenings while Kofi did his homework at the kitchen table, and in the small hours of the night when she sat with her laptop and the apartment was quiet and the screen cast its pale light across her face. She thought about what it meant to see clearly. Not just to look, anyone could look, but to actually see, to follow the thing you noticed past the place where most people got uncomfortable and kept going, all the way to where the truth was sitting, patient and unhurried, waiting for someone to arrive. She thought about Jerome's face in the boardroom when the pattern clicked into place. She thought about Darian's face in the corridor afterward. She thought about her son, who wanted to build systems, and about the kind of man she wanted him to become, one who would listen to the people in gray uniforms, who would understand that expertise did not announce itself, who would know that the most important question in any room was not who belongs here but what is true. She closed her laptop at 1:17 a.m. She checked on Kofi, who was asleep with one arm thrown over his textbook in the way he always slept, as if even in unconsciousness he was trying to hold on to what he was learning. She turned off the light. And somewhere across the city, in the server rooms of Vantera Capital, Axiom ran its cycles in clean, unbroken sequence. Each trade executed once, and only once, the loop closed, the flaw corrected, the system made whole by the observation of a woman whose name, for 2 years and 4 months, no one had thought to ask. Until they had no choice but to.